Hello friends, today I'm going to show you how to make a project bag. Could be for a knitting project or a sewing project, or really anything you want to put in it because it's cute and simple to make. And I have all the measurements in the description below for 3 different sizes. So far I have only made small and medium, but I'm going to be making the large with you today. This is the small. It's 8 by 8, not counting the base. It's a good size for, say, a sock project. It has batting in it, so it's got a little bit of squish. It's got some upcycled denim on the bottom, so you can use some old jeans. Totally optional. You could make this all as a solid piece of fabric, or you could make it all in denim, whatever you like, really. It's got a little slip pocket inside that I've divided into 2. Let's just fold it out. You can get a better look. So there's a little slip pocket inside, and I'm scaling up the width of the slip pocket with the larger bags just so that it looks more proportional. And it just has a simple drawstring closure. I think that's really cute. The medium one looks like this. The width of this one is 9.5 inches. Exact same construction, just bigger pieces. Again, slip pocket inside. Drawstring closure. Optional 2-tone outer. Again, I think that'd be really useful for a medium-sized project, like a cowl, maybe. And the largest bag will be 11 inches across. And we'll look at that at the end of the video when I've finished making them. Hope you enjoy. I'm adding in this little bit of film that I am taking at the end of the sewing day because I want to encourage you to watch the whole video before you attempt sewing this bag, because I ended up doing the top stitching 2 different ways because I made a mistake. It actually came out well both ways. So I just wanted to warn you not to kind of just dive in and follow along, because there's going to be a little hitch there in the middle when it comes to the top stitching. So I want you to know ahead of time that there's 2 options: top stitching before you sew the big pieces together and top stitching at the end. And either way works well. Okay? I've cut out all my pieces for the bag. I've decided that this is going to be my outer on this one. As I say, I cut 6 out. So if you see me sewing other different color fabrics during the video, don't get confused. I'm just making 6. But they're all made in exactly the same way. I won't be mentioning any measurements while I'm sewing because this is for the larger bags. But I do have a medium and a small, so I don't want to confuse things by mentioning measurements here. I'll have all the measurements in the description box under the video. What I do with the 2-tone bag is I cut my pieces out a little bit big. The width is the right size, but for my height, I add a little bit more than a seam allowance so that when I have joined these 2 pieces together, I then trim them to size. Basically, the top and the bottom are 50% of the total height of the bag, so half and half. And I found that makes for a pleasing proportion when the boxed bottoms have been put in, because then you don't see all of the denim and it has a nice proportion compared to the pretty fabric. So here's my 2 pieces of upper outers, my 2 pieces of denim. If you're cutting from jeans, then for the largest bag, you may find it easier to cut this way for the legs of jeans, unless you're okay with having a seam in there. There's absolutely no reason why you can't cut across the leg of a jean and have a seam somewhere in here. Makes for an interesting feature, shows that you've upcycled the denim. Nothing wrong with that at all. For these bags, I actually had a piece of new denim fabric, which I am using, but for my other bags, the smaller sizes, I cut it all from jeans. I've got 2 pieces, long thin strips, which are going to be our drawstring channels. They'll be folded in half and sewn into the top of the bags. And for this group, I am using the same lining for all of them. I went to the fabric store yesterday. They had a good sale on, and I bought a big chunk of this fabric, which has bags and shoes and cameras and things on it. And I'm putting the same lining in all of them. So that is my lining, 2 lining pieces cut out. And also 2 batting pieces cut out. I got to the end of a roll of batting that I had bought, and I needed to do a little bit of Frankensteining here. All I did was butt up a couple of small pieces of batting and used a very wide zigzag on them to join them together so I didn't waste it. This is a cotton batting with a little bit of polyester scrim. It's not very thick. It's easy to sew through. It does make a nice squishy feel to the bag without being too lofty and puffy. I like it. So for each bag, I have my batting, I have my linings, I have my drawstring channels. Oh, and finally, this little pocket piece. It's important to note which way round you have your fabric. If you've got a one-way print, what you'll need to do is make sure you're cutting your pieces out the right way round. I always put the width as the first measurement and the height as the second measurement. So with the pocket piece, you do need the height to be the longer measurement, because what you're going to be doing is folding it and sewing it, so it will end up like that. And if you have a specific large print that you want to feature here, make sure it's on the bottom half of the piece when you're cutting it out, so that when you're folding that behind, it features it nicely. When you're just making one bag, obviously you can match your thread to your fabric nicely. I'm using a neutral grey today because it will go with all of my fabrics quite well. I am using just a universal needle. The way I've designed this bag through trial and error is that you won't have any really thick seams to sew through. The top of the bag is going to be easy to get your bits matched up, and we're going to be doing the top stitching before we do the final seaming, so that you don't have to have any problems with skip stitches or struggling over thick side seams. So the first step is going to be to take each of our denim pieces and to sew the upper outer to it. I have allowed for a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, or 1 centimetre, except for in the pocket. What I found is that there's no reason to have a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance in the pocket. So to have the pocket be a little bit more roomy, I will be doing probably a 1/4 inch. It's not crucial, as long as it looks good and you're happy with it. So I am going to now chain piece all of my denims and outers together. If in the case of my one-way print, I'll be making sure it's the correct way up with the denim at the bottom. I'm going to be using a stitch length of 2.4, and when top stitching, a stitch length of 3. And I am back stitching at the beginning and end of every seam. A tip when it comes to using denim from jeans. Sometimes, quite often, the jeans these days are stretch denim. They've got some spandex or lycra or polyester in them, and they will tend to stretch a bit as you sew. Instead of using a cotton batting, you could use a fusible fleece, which will obviously minimize your stretching, or just an interfacing, a non-woven fusible interfacing, or a woven like the Pellon SF101, and that will stop it from stretching. If it does stretch out a bit when you're seaming beyond the end of your seam, when you're trimming the length, you can always trim the sides a little bit as well. It doesn't really make a difference in your finished project. A good way to minimize stretching in your denim or any fabric is to use an even feed foot or a walking foot on your machine. I use my walking foot for almost everything. Almost. Because it gives a nice result. Things don't bunch up in front of the needle if you have both layers of your fabric moving at the same rate. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up these pieces that I have just sewn together. I'm going to take them to the ironing board. I'm going to press the quilting cotton up, making sure that my seam allowance is pointing up. When you've got a thicker fabric, it makes sense to go with the flow and let seam allowance go the way it wants to go. Now that each of these has been pressed with the seam allowance pointing up, I'm going to take them over to my cutting mat. I'm going to trim them to size. I've trimmed a small strip off the top and the bottom. This line here is roughly in the middle, give or take 1/4 of an inch, not crucial. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to just spray baste. I'm going to use my Odif 505 temporary basting spray just to keep the cotton batting and my fabric neatly held together. You might decide you want to do some quilting on this, or use a fusible fleece or interfacing, completely up to you. I am just going to have the cotton batting held inside the bag with one line of top stitching and the outer hems. It's quick and simple, and I happen to have lots of this cotton batting on hand. You just need a light spray of this, otherwise it gets soaked through the fabric and it's wet and nasty. It's repositionable, which is nice because it doesn't usually go on exactly where you want it the first time. And it's nice because it just holds it in place while you're doing any sewing. One should probably use this in a well-ventilated area. This is not a well-ventilated area, being that I am in my sewing room with the door firmly closed while I'm filming. I'll try not to breathe in too deeply. My outers are ready for top stitching. They're trimmed to size, and I have pasted the quilt batting on the back of each one. I'm now going to go and run a line of top stitching on the pretty side of the fabric, because I want to catch these seam allowances that are underneath here down. So I'm going to top stitch above this line, maybe about 1/8 of an inch away, with a longer stitch length than I used. So 3.5 either is good. One of the reasons I like a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance is that that's basically the width of my foot. My needle is 3/8 of an inch from the side edge, the outside side edge of my foot. And it's just easy, so that then you can use that as a guide. When I'm top stitching, I'm using the inside edge of the left hand arm of my walking foot as a guide to keep me on the straight and narrow. And there we have a line of top stitching. And now I'm going to do all my other pieces the same way. My outer bags are ready to go, and now I'm going to put them aside because I need to add my labels to my linings. So I'm going to take these over to the ironing board and fuse my labels 1.5 inches down from the top. If you don't have a label, obviously you can skip this step. Or if you have a prettier label than I do, you can always add it to the outside at this stage. I fused my label 1.5 inches down from the top centrally, and I'm just going to stitch around it. I decided on this method of labeling my products a couple of months ago. It's not the best necessarily. Fancy custom-made sew-in labels might be prettier, but I buy this from wherever I can find it at a good price. I originally got this from Amazon. It's fusible cotton fabric sheets. And then I found them cheaper at my local fabric store. So I got a couple more packs. And you put it in your printer and you print straight on it. Thankfully, I have some young men in the house who are very obviously technologically gifted, shall we say. So after I had been using this method for a while, I wanted to change my font and put a little icon on it to match my business cards, which I got printed recently. And so my youngest son has managed to figure out a way to get it to print with the correct font and the little icon and better spaced, so that when I cut them out, there'll be plenty of room to sew around them. This works for now. So this is what it looks like when I've sewn around it. It's not perfect, and everyone turns out differently. I do my best to stay fairly straight with the lines. But yeah, if anyone comments on it, I'll say, look at the name, Stitches and Slapdashery. So the fact I have slapdash stitches, oh my goodness, the fact I have slapdash stitches on my label is totally deliberate, right? Now that my labels are attached, I'm going to be dealing with the drawstring channels. So these will be folded in half, but first we're going to neaten the ends. So we're going to take these narrow ends, and I'll do this at the ironing board. I'm going to press down about 1/4 inch on the end here, and then another 1/4 inch. I'll press those all in place, and then I'm going to sew across each of them. And then I'll take them back to the ironing board and fold them in half. I've pressed all my hems down, and now I'm going to sew from the wrong side, fairly close to this fold here, so that it holds it down. And I'm going to chain sew again. Let's go from the end of one to the beginning of the next. Make it efficient. This would be a good time for me to remind you to check your stitch length, because if you went from top stitching to seam stitching, you may have accidentally left your stitch length at 3. How many times have I done that? Lost count. Another question for you. Have you changed your needle lately? I have to say, I was one of those people I was guilty of using the same needle for months on end, not realizing how important it was to sew with a sharp needle. And also the right needle for the job, because there's a lot of different kinds. So if you've been using your needle for multiple projects, or more than 8 hours of sewing, or any other guideline that you want to give yourself so that you don't end up with a clunk, clunk, clunk from a blunt needle, this is your reminder to change it. My bobbin decided to run out, so I took the opportunity to go and take a break, if you know what I mean. I've seen questions on some of the Facebook groups about how you manage to get through lots and lots of sewing without pain, and I said, take lots of breaks. My secret is drink lots of water. Because if you drink lots of water, you have to go to the bathroom a lot. So then I have to run upstairs and run back downstairs, and that gets the blood moving. Also, it's good to stop for lunch or dinner. Do a little bit of stretching. If you're only making one bag today, you probably don't have to worry too much about that. But I'm making 6, which can take about 6 hours. Always feels like the cutting out of the fabric takes longer than everything else. If you find that you're sewing and your fabric is kind of bunching up at the beginning, or getting pushed down into the hole under the needle, a good idea is to use a little scrap of fabric. It could be anything. A couple of layers of cotton is ideal. Sew across it first and then go sewing straight onto your good fabric, because that will give you a nice clean edge. All of my drawstring channel pieces are now hemmed, so I am going to go to the ironing board, fold them in half lengthwise, and they'll be ready to insert into the bag. Now that all my drawstring channels are ready to roll, I'm going to put them aside and going to focus on the pocket. The pocket is a tall rectangle, because what you're going to do is fold it in half across the middle, crosswise. I think that's crosswise. And then we are going to sew it up with a gap for turning. So there's your pocket piece. You're going to sew here to here and here to here, and there's going to be a little gap along the long straight edge there for turning it right side out. What I like to do is start here and go this way, and then flip it over and go back to here and go that way. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to try for a approximately 1/4 inch seam. Now what I'm going to do is trim the corners, being careful obviously not to cut the stitching. The more you can trim, the sharper your corners will be. It helps to have some sort of pokey tool. Push your corners out. Just going to finger press my seam allowance over the gap area. And then I'm going to turn it through. You want something that's got a decent point but not too sharp, because you don't want to go blasting right through your fabric and then have to make a new pocket. It's important to push out your sides as well. Sometimes you can lose a lot of space in the pocket because your side seams folded in on themselves. Okay, so now I'm going to go and press this flat. I'm not going to close this up because when I sew the pocket onto the lining, it'll get closed up, but I am going to top stitch across that top edge where the fabric is folded and not sewn. My pocket's pressed and ready to top stitch. This is another point at which you need to be aware of one-way prints because of the way it's folded. If I sew it onto the lining of my bag this way up, the opening is at the bottom edge, which is where it should be. It's going to be upside down. So I just need to make sure that when I sew it onto the lining, that I have my print the correct way up. And also when I top stitch, I'm going to make sure it's that way up, so it looks better. Lengthen my stitch again, and I'm just going to run a line of stitching across about 1/8 of an inch from the top edge. A little bit of back stitching. I think the top stitching does look better if it doesn't run off the edges, so I try and start and end just inside the end of the fabric. But actually that light grey thread is fairly well disguised on this fabric, so that's handy. Now that my pocket is constructed, I can attach it to my lining. And I like to make it on the same part of lining that has my label on, because that's basically what I think of as the back of the bag. So the label and the pocket are on the same side. But I'm going to position my quilting ruler so that I can get the top of the pocket centered and straight, pin it on. Gummy pin, let's skip that one. Nothing worse than gummy pins, or ones that are damaged and start pulling on your fabric. Okay, so I've positioned that there. I'm also going to do the line down the center of the pocket, which is completely optional. Absolutely love friction pens. I like to buy them in different colors. The line will just iron off because the heat makes it go away. Just be aware that it can come back with cold. I've heard that if you go out in sub-zero weather, that the line can come back. While I'm pinning my 6 bags, we could talk about whether we pre-wash our fabrics. Obviously, when you're using old denims, they've been washed multiple times. And so it's really personal choice. If you want to pre-wash your cottons first, do it. I don't. A lot of my cottons, I suppose if I had washed them when they first came in the house, when they were large pieces, it wouldn't seem so daunting a task. But a lot of my pieces are small now, and if I started washing them, they just get in a big frayed tangle. What I've done with my business cards, which I haven't even used yet, they're so new, they're still in the box, and I've never given one out yet because I haven't started the markets yet. But on the reverse of my business cards, I have put washing instructions, because my plan is to give out a business card each time somebody buys something. I did think of putting them inside the bags, and then I thought, no, someone might buy 3 things and they don't need 3 business cards. And then I just burned through them far too fast. So I'm going to give someone a card with each purchase, and on the back it says, most of my products are hand wash cold. And that covers it, really. If it's vinyl, obviously it's just white clean, but there aren't many things that I've made out of vinyl. Most of them are fabric. And if you hand wash an item in cold water and let it dry hanging or flat, I very much doubt shrinkage will be an issue. Now we're ready. We're going to sew the 3 sides of the pocket, sides and bottom. I usually do a couple of back tacks here, maybe forward, back, forward, and then around, and the same here. And then I go back and I start at the bottom, and then I'm just going to sew up the red line and do a back tack here to divide it into 2. Of course, you can make the pocket any size you like. You could make it deeper. You could make skinny channels for fitting pens or crochet hooks in, and make it quite a bit deeper. Just if you do make it deeper, obviously you're going to cut a taller piece, which will be twice the height of your pocket plus your seam allowance. Just bear in mind that this is going to be boxed at the bottom, so you don't want it to be too far down or it'll interfere with your base. And remember to shorten your stitch. Sewn on, I sew about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge there, and I try not to shoot over the end of the fabric at the top edges, and on the center line I try not to go past the top stitching. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one outer. Now if you have a label, a fancy label that you have sewn to the front of the bag, keep that in mind when you are assembling, because you will want the front of the bag. I think I'm going to use, for this particular fabric, this as the front, because I like the way that the bike is positioned right there in the middle. So this is going to be the front of my bag in this case. So I'm going to take my plain lining, which has no label or pocket, and I'm going to have that be attached to that piece. And then for my other outer, I am going to use the piece that has the pocket and the label on. And now we have another little spot where we have to figure out which way around to put our channels, because if you have used a one-way fabric, again, it could be important which way you put your channel. Obviously, with this fabric, it doesn't matter. Either way, it looks the same. So what I'm going to do is, if I put my fabric, my outer down, and I put my channel there as if it was attached, then I can see that this bicycle is upside down. That's not going to work for me. So I'll flip it around, and I can see roses. And the wheel of the Vespa over here is the correct way up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at it the right way up and flip it down and attach it like that. Another way to remember that you've got it the right way up is if you're seeing your outer print the correct way up and your channel print the correct way up, then you've done it right, because when you've sewn it, it's going to flip up like this. That's the way you want it. So what I do is I grab 3 little wonder clips, and I usually eyeball this. If you're fussier than me, measure it. Otherwise, eyeball it. I can usually estimate that this and this is about the same. If you really, really want to check, you could use a ruler, or you could mark or notch the center of the channel and the outer and have it perfectly aligned. So I clip it in 3 places. And then I take my lining, make sure it's the correct way up. Right sides together. Flip it again. It doesn't often happen, but it has happened once or twice where when I've sewn, my channel has shifted and it's been wonky when it's been inserted. We don't want that. If you want to double check you got it right, you can open that up, make sure your channel is not showing upside down print. So my edges are fairly well aligned there. My top edges are aligned. I've clipped in that, and then I want to take my other outer, my other channel. Again, I need to make sure it's correct. Right now it's not. There's an upside down bike there. Here we go. Make sure it's the right way up. Flip it down, clip it on. Take the lining piece with the pocket, flip it over, right sides together, lining up all your edges. Once you've got those 2 pieces all clipped together like that, all you have to do is sew across that top seam on both pieces. What I like to do is, if I've got an uninterfaced layer of quilting cotton on one side, I'll put it that way round. The more stable fabric or heavier fabric, I usually make sure is on top when I'm sewing the seam. Another little hint, check the screw on your presser foot every now and again. The other day I was doing a lot of heavy sewing and I found that my walking foot screw had loosened quite drastically and it wasn't working properly. So I like to check that every now and again. Now we have our outers and inners joined together across the top. Going to open them out. And put the right sides together. And to make sure that my linings are going to be facing each other and my outers are going to be facing each other. Right sides together. And then what we will do is clip or pin them together so that the seams match at this point. This is the point at which it's really important to be as accurate as possible. So try and match up these 2 seams as best you can. Clip it, pin it, do whatever it takes. Much as I like clips, if you pin it, you can then open it up and make sure that it looks good. So those are the bits I always pin first. And then the second place, if you decided to do a two-tone bag, then this is the next place that you really ideally want it to match up. I mean, most people are probably not going to inspect your bags that closely, unless they also are sewers and are just trying to figure out how you made it so that they can copy your idea. There you go, that's pretty good. That's matched up beautifully. Of course, that doesn't mean that when I come to sew it, it will stay there. Sometimes things shift in the sewing. Not super happy with the way this batting has shifted and it's sticking out in places. I could have trimmed it back. Mrs. Slapdash that I am, I have not. You can probably see the batting is a bit short on here and here. When I sew it, I'm going to be sewing it from this side. I may trim it because I don't want my seam allowances to miss bits. I mean, I don't want my seams to miss bits, is what I meant. So I've pinned the 4 crucial spots. I'm going to also flip along the bottom. Flip along the sides. All right, very amateurishly pinned and clipped. Ready to go to the sewing machine. So what we're going to do, if you've made bags before, you know this. We're going to leave a gap at the bottom of the lining. You might like to take a friction pen or some other fabric marker or any old pen really, because no one's ever going to see this. And you could maybe put a couple of X's here, because that's where you don't want to sew, and you want to remember that. It might be a good idea for me to put it on both sides, because I'm not sure what side I'm going to be sewing it from at this point. You can leave a little reminder for yourself. And what I used to do is I used to just start here, sew along, all the way down, along and up and around in one big fell swoop. But I prefer to do it a different way these days, because matching up these parts is important to me. I'm going to start sewing right here. I'm going to come down this side of the outer, and then I'm going to stop there. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to sew from here down and across. If you get a little bit of stretching or puckering in this corner, it doesn't matter, because you're going to be cutting that off anyway. So there's no need to backstitch when you get to the bottom, because you're going to be cutting the corners off. And then I'm going to go back and I am going to do my lining. So I'll overlap my stitching a bit. So that's a good idea, because it gives it a bit more reinforcing. I'm going to sew down the side of the lining and around to here and backstitch. And then I will sew from this side down around the corner to here and backstitch and leave that gap. It does take a little more time, but I think it's going to help you get your seams matched better. Is your stitch length still right? 2.4? Perfect. So no need to backstitch here, because we're going to be going over this part twice anyway. So now I've done this side, I'm going to flip it, and then I'm going to start back here. I have to be careful because my batting is a little further than back in the edge. So about it there. It's around the corner, so you go opposite. As I said, it doesn't matter if there's a bit of bunching in the batting right here on this corner. because we're going to be boxing the corners and cutting that bit off afterwards. Now we're going to do the lining. I find the lining can look a little baggy sometimes. You may have noticed that if you've made bags before. So what I do when I've got past the humpy bit here is I'll veer in a little bit and make my seam allowance a little bit wider. And across the bottom, I'll make the seam allowance a bit wider. It just makes the lining a little bit less baggy. I'm going to put back that section up there. I'm going to take my seam allowance a little wider here. One of the things I did not mention before is when you have come around this corner on your lining and you stop for the gap, bear in mind you are going to be cutting off these corners to box them. And so you don't want this seam to end too close to where you're going to be cutting. On this size bag, I'm going to be cutting a 1.5 inch square. So I've left that maybe a little bit close. And you really don't need a lot of room to turn the bag through, maybe only like 3 inches. So I could have come across a little further when I sewed that seam. Be on the safe side. So my battery on my phone decided to die, so I've had to plug it in and wait for it to start up again while I finished off all 6 of the sewing the outers and inners together, and then I got to the 5th one and realized I'd screwed up. When I made these small bags, I found it a real pain to top stitch over these bulky side seams. My walking foot skipped some stitches and it was really annoying me, and I was not sure how I was going to fix it. And then I had a little light bulb moment, and on the medium-sized ones, I top stitched before I sewed the pieces together. And that was great. And that was what I was going to do with the big bags. So what did I go and do? I sewed all of these together, well, 5 of them, before remembering that I hadn't top stitched. So we're going to show you the 6th bag, the way I think it's better to do them, because then you're not struggling to get over thick side seams. But if your machine can handle thick side seams, there's no reason why you can't top stitch afterwards. So what I've done for this one is I have ironed my drawstring channel up. This is still all opened up. The lining and the outer are spread out. The channel has been ironed up towards the lining. The seam allowances have been pushed towards the outer, so that when I top stitch along here, I'm going to catch those seam allowances on the back. It means that the lining isn't included in the top stitching, but I found that that wasn't an issue. When I finished these the other day and pressed them, lots of heat and steam, I found that the lining sits fine without being included in the top stitching. You just have to make sure that your seam allowances on the side are opened flat and not bunching up. So we are going to do this bit of top stitching. I am not going to go and unpick 5 bags worth of sewing, especially as some of it is through batting and you can't see the stitches through that anyway. Longer stitch length, bit of top stitching, bit of kicking myself, and we will move on. Got to make sure that the seam allowances are under there where I'm sewing. Don't get away from me. It does look nicer with top stitching. You could probably make a case for not bothering for that at all, but I like it. I like the way it looks. And again, because this is real life, warts and all, we see that the bobbin thread ran out. And you know why the bobbin thread ran out? Because I was top stitching and it's fully visible on the right side. And what I'm going to have to do, it ran out back here, so I'm just going to unpick this little short bit of seam here and start again, because you want the top stitching to look perfect, right? Or as near to it as possible. That's the third time I filled that bobbin today. This takes a lot of thread. Okay, so now that these two pieces are top stitched the way I wanted to do them all, I can sew them together. Now that my pieces are all sewn together, we need to box the bottoms. And I have, for each size of the bag, different measurements. As the bags get bigger, I box the corners a little deeper. So you just need to measure, make sure to measure from the seam line. We don't measure from the edge of the fabric, we measure from the seam line. So I'm just using a regular pen because no one's ever going to see this. We're going to be cutting along this line. And I'm going to measure and measure again and double, triple check, because Murphy's Law says that if I don't, I'll get it wrong. So as you can see, my square is measured from my seam line. You can go about this one of two ways. Sometimes I have opened this out, squished the corners, sewn across without cutting. But then you're faffing around trying to figure out whether your seams are lined up. And I just find it easier to cut them out ahead of time. So I've drawn my square on all four corners. I'm going to go and do that with the rest of the bags now, and then I'll cut them out. Once your corners are all marked, you can cut them out. Now, I haven't reinforced my seams at the points where I'm going to cut them. When I flatten this out to sew it, I'll be really careful not to yank on the seams so that they don't split on me. And then what we'll do is we will open this up. We'll open this up, pull it out sideways carefully so that the seams are matching up. A good way to make sure that they're lined up is to nest them. Push all the seam allowances on one side one way and the other side the other way. Still have to check that they're butted up against each other. But when you've cut the squares like this, it pretty much all falls into place quite well. Because this is bulky, I'm going to use a giant clip. And we just have to do all four corners the same. What I do is, if I've pushed this one this way, I'll push this one the same way. Again, we're just pulling it out. This one is the one that's probably more likely to start unstitching itself. So just take care not to pull on it. Like that. And then we can sew them. make sure to back stitch at the beginning and end, and I also back stitched over where this seam is just to add some strength. I don't know if it's really necessary. I don't think there's going to be a huge amount of strain on those areas. You just never know. And now we're at the point where we can turn everything right side out. In one way, birthing a bag is the most exciting part, but it's also a bit nerve-wracking in case you find something that you did wrong. Push out my corners on my denim base here. Check whether I matched up my seams. Oh, not bad, not bad. Yeah, not bad at all. Okay, so I always leave my closing of the gap in the lining to the absolute end now, because this is the one where I actually remembered to top stitch before I sewed the pieces together. And so I'm going to iron around the top in a minute, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to double check that here my seam allowances are opened so that not all of the bulk is in the one place. There we go. I've opened up the seam allowances there, and then I'll fold it down, keeping it like that. And then I'll do the same on the other side. I could have pressed my seam allowances open before I turned it. But you know, I forgot to do that, didn't I? All right, so I'm going to push that lining into there. And I'm going to take this over to my ironing board and press all around, giving it plenty of steam, especially on these edges here where it's a little bulky. And that one is done. With the bag that I top stitched before turning, you'll remember I said that the lining isn't top stitched. I did press the inside and pushed it away and down from the drawstring channel, and I gave these bits plenty of steam, and I think they look fine. But if you're worried about your top stitching line not matching up at the sides, if that bothers you, or if you like to catch the lining down, then you can certainly do it the way I'm going to have to do it with the remainder of my bags. These ones I'm going to have to press and top stitch after the fact, which means that the lining will be caught in it and the stitching will go straight across here instead of finishing on one side and starting on the other. As I say, when I made the other bags, the small ones, I did have a little bit of annoying skipping of stitches around the seam. Now, your sewing machine may not do that. My sewing machine is not supposed to do that. And whilst I do have one of those little jumper gadgets that I can use with my regular sewing machine foot, I'm using my walking foot, and I can't use a jumper. Let me show you what I'm talking about, if I can find it. So this is a hump jumper. When you get to a bit of a thick seam, you can slide this, depending on how thick the seam is. Doesn't matter which side you use, depends on the thickness of the seam, but you can slide this around your needle from the back, and it raises the foot's reach, I guess you call it, or headroom. And then once you get past the really lumpy bits, you can put it in from the front and sew a few more stitches, so you don't get that annoying bit of change in the tension of your stitches, or as mine was doing, it just wasn't sewing them at all. Sorry to subject you to all this painful nonsense, but we're learning together here. So what I decided to do before I turn my bag through, because I have to top stitch over this area, I'm taking out some of the bulk around the seam here, mostly batting. I'm going to start over near a side seam, but not right on a side seam. Extend my stitch length again to 3, because I want my whole presser foot on the edge of the fabric, like on the fabric, not hanging off the fabric. I'm going to move my needle to the right so it's closer to the edge. So the edge of my presser foot is right on the top edge of the fabric, and I've moved my needle over to position 7, which is as far right as it can go. And I'm going to hold my tongue just right, cross my fingers, and hope this doesn't skip this time. I'm smoothing out the fabric underneath where the line is. And hope it is. I'm going to leave up now, because I made it first time. Okay, moment of truth. Hey, it worked out fine on that side. It did it. It did it perfectly. Oh my gosh, I'm so pleased. Okay. So I have a full bobbin now. Well, I have a half full bobbin because I'm burning through thread like nobody's business today. So I'm not going to run out while I'm top stitching. So that's a crisis averted already. The top stitching gods were looking favourably upon me today, apart from the time that my bobbin ran out, but that was a minor thing. My stitching looks fine, and now I'm ready to close the gap in the lining. If I'd thought about it ahead of time, which I wasn't, I would have pressed my seam allowances back from the inside, because then when you flip it to the outside, that edge is already nice and crisp and ready just to slide together happily and get stitched. However, didn't do that. So a little trick is just to put your fingers in either side of that gap, pull sideways gently, and it usually lines up pretty well. And then you can pin or clip it, or you can just slide it under your needle and hope for the best. Let me just make sure that my needle is back at the center. I have done that more than once as well, where I have started sewing with my needle off center and wondered why it wasn't actually going through the fabric. Again, a little back stitch. Now we're just sewing as close to the edge as possible, like a 1/16 of an inch or a couple of millimeters away. Well, I always say it's a 1/16 of an inch, but somehow it seems to waver off a little further away from the edge than I would have liked. This is slapdash sewing at its best, folks. There's the gap sewn together. Of course, you could do it by hand if you want an invisible seam. Who's got time for that, right? Not me. I've been in my sewing room almost all day. It's a good thing I scheduled pizza for dinner, because the family know how to make that and they are cooking it right now. Okay, so the inside of the bag is done. The outside of the bag is done. Just the drawstring cord to go. For the next stage, one of these bodkins is kind of handy. The little clawy end holds onto the thing. You slide it down to tighten it, and it helps getting things through the casing. You could just use a large safety pin. In the measurements I'm going to put under the video, I've estimated the cord length. Really, it's up to you. I like to go for double the width of my casing plus maybe 4 inches. So you can see it's going to go around and then stick out about this much. You don't really want it. Well, maybe you do. I don't want it to be super long when the bag is open. I want it to be fairly close, because when you snug it up, obviously it's going to be hanging out quite a lot. So I'm going to cut the cords I need for these bags. So you need 2 cords for each bag, the same length, obviously. And you're just going to thread one in right to left on one side, flip it over, thread it in through the other casing, from right to left, knot it, just do an overhand knot. There's various ways to finish off the ends of cords like this as well. Some people make cute little fabric doodads that cover the end of the knot and look cute, but not me, not usually. The other cord is going to go through the other way. So you've got your knot on the left, and now you're going to put your other string right to left through the top channel, flip it over, put this string through this channel, right to left. Tie this in an overhand knot. You could also put beads on this or something like that. There's all sorts of ways to embellish this bag. Because this is a drawstring bag, and because it's got basically something you can use as a handle, I didn't add any sort of handle on the side. What you can do with these is you can include a small tab sticking out of the side seam with a D-ring on it for a wristlet, or you can make it, you know, about 6 inches long so that it's a built-in wristlet. But for this, because it's got the drawstring cord, I decided not to do that. If I make a range of zipper project bags next, I'll put a handle on them, because they won't have their own inbuilt handles. So there we are. It was a struggle in places, not because this is a hard or challenging project, but because I always seem to make things difficult for myself. Phew, that was a long day of sewing. It was a beautiful sunny day and I missed it all. I started about 10 o'clock this morning and now it's dinner time and it's dark. So which bag do you think is your favorite? I love these fabrics. I had this in 3 different colorways, and I think they're all beautiful. And then the gold dot is pretty too. And of course the French girl in Paris. And then the cute little bike with the roses and the scooter. Do you have a favorite? They all came out great in the end, despite the fact that, as usual, I had a few hiccups along the way. Hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Do let me know if you make it. Put a comment under the video if you have any feedback for me. If there's anything else that you would like me to demo that's not too complicated. It could be sewing, it could be crochet, it could be knitting, but yeah, not too complicated. Let me know. I'll see what I can do. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.